Well, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to have members of all three of our congregations joining together today as we have a combined service and then our annual parish meeting later. But it's lovely to have folk from 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock and from our Dinka congregation too joining together. Have you ever received a mixed report card? Charlie's handwriting has improved markedly. When copying lines in detention, he is now able to write with 3 pens at once. Charlie successfully completed the Term 1 woodwork project shortly before the summer holidays. Charlie shows great ability in gymnastics class, particularly when climbing out the classroom window. Charlie is a student of great initiative. Perhaps he could use it for something other than setting the paper trolley on fire. Charlie is a natural leader. Unfortunately, he leads his classmates astray. Charlie's performance is satisfactory for a new graduate. After 5 years in the job, we would hope for more. Well, have you ever received a mixed report card? If you have, it turns out that you're in very exalted company. At first glance, when you read through the early chapters of the book of 1 Kings in the Old Testament, it seems that King Solomon made a good beginning, but a bad ending. As his story moves from wisdom, wealth, and honour to idolatry and ruin. But that is too simplistic. Solomon's story is a little more complicated than that. You see, from the start of Solomon's story, there are signs of the coming disaster. Did you notice any in the Bible reading? Today's passage provides a mixed report card on the early years of Solomon's reign. Chapter 2, which we saw last week, raised some questions about the establishment of Solomon's kingdom. Some of his early actions looked violent and vengeful. Well, the opening verses of chapter 3, several years into his reign, paint a picture of divided loyalties and misplaced priorities. Solomon made a political alliance by marrying the daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Smart, right? But God had rescued the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. And in the book of Deuteronomy, one of the books of the Old Testament that establishes God's laws, his commands for his people, God explicitly forbade the king from making the people return to Egypt to acquire horses. And Solomon, it turns out, through this alliance, acquired 12,000 of them. In Deuteronomy, God also prohibited intermarriage with foreigners who could lead the Israelites into worshipping foreign gods. Having married Pharaoh's daughter, Solomon later loved many foreign wives from the nations with which God had forbidden the Israelites to intermarry. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, we're told. Quite the harem. And they led him astray and turned his heart after other gods. At the start of chapter 2, David urged Solomon to keep God's law. At the start of chapter 3, Solomon has already broken that law. The author of 1 Kings mentions the completion of Solomon's building projects out of chronological order, perhaps to show us that Solomon's priorities were already being shaped by his foreign wife, by other considerations than putting God first. The temple was actually completed before the palace in 7 years, while Solomon spent a whole 13 years building his palace. Because several years into his reign, Solomon had not yet built the temple, the people were still sacrificing in the high places, as Solomon himself, we read, did. In fact, rather than following the laws of Deuteronomy about focusing worship on one sanctuary, destroying the high places, and removing foreign religious influences, Solomon went on to proliferate high places, to worship the gods of all his foreign wives. There is no indication of apostasy here in chapter 3. Solomon is still worshipping the Lord, but the seeds have been sown. Solomon loved the Lord, sincerely perhaps, but not wholeheartedly. Do you see, he loved the Lord, except his love was qualified. He is the only king in the book of Kings said to have loved the Lord, but we read in chapter 11 that he also loved many foreign women and worshipped their gods, and that his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord. Nevertheless, there is something very positive in Solomon's report card in chapter 3, as the gracious God responds to a humble prayer. Even though Solomon worshipped in a forbidden high place, God graciously appeared to him in a dream and said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." What would you ask for? Solomon recognises God's great kindness to his father David. He mentions it twice, but in between, where that because is, it seems that Solomon thinks that God's kindness to David is a reward for David's faithfulness and righteousness, rather than a reflection of God's unconditional covenant love and faithfulness to his own promises. You might remember back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the passage where God makes his great promise to King David. God promised never to take his love away from David as he had from Saul, even when David did wrong. Here is where Solomon gets it right. He is not literally a little child at this point, but he recognises the enormity of the task of ruling God's people as king, and he asks for wisdom and moral discernment from God to govern well. The Lord was pleased. Notice that the Lord was pleased by what Solomon asked for and by what he didn't ask for, long life or wealth for himself or the death of his enemies. God even promises to give Solomon the things he has not asked for, wealth and honour, and if Solomon walks in obedience to God, long life as well. Did you notice, though, that God doesn't promise Solomon the death of his enemies, which Solomon himself had orchestrated in chapter 2. In chapter 2, David urged Solomon to deal with his enemies according to his own wisdom, and the result was the taking of life. In chapter 3, Solomon asks for wisdom from God to govern the people. Next week, we will see an example of that wisdom in the second half of the chapter, and the result is not the taking of life, but the saving of life. So, Our reading provides a mixed report card on the early years of Solomon's reign. Positively, it reports the humble prayer that leads to Solomon's legendary wisdom and wealth. Negatively, it reports the early warning signs of a heart not wholly devoted to God, flagging the divided loyalties that will lead, not very many chapters later, to a divided kingdom. Well, that's Solomon. Today's reading challenges us to consider our own mixed report cards. It was the Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn who famously wrote, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." Taking his lead from Solzhenitsyn, a Christian friend of mine argues that all our motives are mixed. In this life, we are never as good as we should be or as bad as we could be. So we need to be realistic and cautious in judging our own and other people's actions and motives. We need wise and discerning hearts. And our own hearts so often deceive us. And we need to recognise what Solomon does not seem to recognise in 1 Kings chapter 3, that we depend on God's gracious covenant love. It is foolishness, you see, not wisdom, to hope that God will treat us according to what we deserve. Instead, we should pray that he will treat us according to his promises, that he will continue to draw our hearts to him, and that one day, when Christ returns, he will transform us and give us hearts wholly devoted to him. We also need to be realistic in our expectations of human leaders in the church and in society. And we need to pray for all those in authority, as Paul urges us in 1 Timothy chapter 2. In reading the Bible, sometimes we make the mistake of looking for human heroes of unalloyed virtue. The thing is, when you read through the Bible, you don't find any. Reading the Bible looking for moralistic examples of people to follow is a very unsatisfying way to read the Bible. Because God is the hero of the Bible's story, not the human actors. And the only king with a heart wholly devoted to God is his Son, Jesus. In John chapter 14, speaking to his followers about his impending suffering and death, Jesus tells them that he will face suffering and death willingly, so that the world may learn that I love the Father and do exactly what my Father has commanded me. Jesus showed his undivided devotion to the Father by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross, to show God's saving love for us. God sent Jesus to be the ruler and rescuer of the world. And Jesus is the King who loves God wholeheartedly. As we submit to his gracious rule, we are being gradually transformed into his image so that our hearts may be like his heart, beating with undivided devotion to God. God bless you.